welcome to the National World War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. Service on Celluloid is brought to you through the generous support of the Albert and Ethel Herstein Charitable Foundation. Each week, our in-house experts sit down with special guests to discuss depictions of World War II on film. Sit back and get ready for a lively debate that will reveal the good and bad of how Hollywood shows the 20th century's most dramatic event. My name is Seth Paradin, historian and digital content manager here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. And today our special guests are Dr. Jason Dawsey, Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency Special Projects Historian.
Good to be here.
Kim Geis, Assistant Director for Curatorial Services here at the museum.
Hi, Seth.
And Colin Makehamson, Assistant Director of Education for Curriculum here at the museum.
Thanks.
Today we'll be discussing the 1987 film Empire of the Sun. The film focuses on the times of a privileged young British boy named Jamie who was born and raised in Shanghai. The film begins as the Japanese invade and conquer Shanghai and send thousands of foreign nationals living in the city to an internment camp. It's here that we follow Jamie's life as he comes of age in the Japanese-run internment camp from 1941 until the end of the war. Empire of the Sun stars Christian Bale, John Malkovich, and Miranda Richardson. The film was directed by Steven Spielberg. It was a critical success but was considered a financial flop. Empire was nominated for 6 Academy Awards, winning none of them. So, as we always start with this, and Kim, you're sitting to my right, so I'll start with you. In your opinion, how accurate is Empire of the Sun?
I think for what it is, it's accurate. It's, in my opinion, it's through the lens of Jim Graham. So as, a childhood window into these experiences, I think it's accurate. I don't think it's not a documentary. So for what it intended to do, I think it's accurate, which, it's somewhat surreal. So how accurate can something be when it's, in that type of situation? I know that's not a great answer.
But it's your final answer, so
I
next.
know, rats.
I'm just kidding. Jason, what about you? What's your opinion?
Well, it's interesting that the film was based on a novel, Empire of the Sun, that J.G. Ballard wrote, and it's autobiographical. And I think the parts of it I thought were really, accurate and gave some real insight are the scenes of the settlement, the international settlement in Shanghai, when the Japanese they're surrounding the area, but they haven't yet moved in, and you get those scenes about what life was like for Jamie and his family, and how they lived this very comfortable life among Europeans, and that had been the case for about a century when the film starts. And I thought those scenes were really, especially revealing about Shanghai had this reputation as a very cosmopolitan city, and a city with casinos and nightclubs and a very posh place, and you get that sense of it, and of course that contrasts so much of what you see later on when they're interned. So I thought that part of the film especially was accurate and interesting about showing what Shanghai was like as the war's already kind of on top of them, but the Japanese haven't yet moved in.
Colin?
Yeah, I think Kim's answer is better than she's giving herself credit for. I think seeing it through the eyes of one person instead of this larger macro portrait of the Pacific War in toto, it gives through the eyes of a child. It is somewhat disjointed and episodic, and I think that is accurate. I don't think a person of that age would have the understanding of what all was going on. So seeing these fleeting glimpses of the larger conflict, I think, is accurate. And as Jason says as well, just seeing these people living these lavish, luxurious lifestyle, while there's literally, Chinese citizens dying of hunger on their front porch. Really sort of the contrast of the people living in these settlements and just who were the beneficiaries of, a century of, imperialist exploitation of the weak Chinese state.
Mm. I think I agree, and I disagree with everybody here. I agree that there are parts of it that are accurate for sure. I mean, it's like any movie, we always say that. But there are parts of it that are inaccurate too. And I get what you're saying, Kim, and Jason, everybody here, that, you're looking at it through the eyes of a child. So, theoretically, a child is not going to see or comprehend, maybe is a better word, the harsher things that are going on, and maybe, put two and two together where other people, adults, would. And, okay, I can kind of give it a pass. I give it a pass there, but it's also supposed to be somewhat historical, and there's a lot of things in there that are frankly glossed over. And I just, I can't give it a pass too good on some of the stuff that they show in the internment camp. What is it? Zhuhao? I'm not really. I don't speak Chinese, so I don't really know how you pronounce it. I try, but there's scenes in there that frankly I think are just that are off, that are way off. But how about the portrayal? You guys talked about the international settlement, which is portrayed in the beginning part of the movie for sure. What do you guys think about the portrayal of that part of Shanghai? How accurate is that in your opinion, Kim? And we'll just go around the horn here. What do you think?
I mean, it's some of my favorite scenes. Are those early scenes of the carnival scene. Is really incredible. In also the party, after the carnival, the party at the house where Jim, flies his kite or flies his little model plane over the little rampart, and right on the other side is this whole, company of Japanese soldiers. So I think it does, speak to sort of the divide, maybe the obliviousness of
of a child.
Of the child, but also, I mean, yeah, I guess the adults did realize the danger in that, come back here, don't run, come back here. But also, it didn't stop them from having this party, or it didn't cause them to leave. So there is, I think, some sense of security, a false sense of security maybe that they had living there.
Yeah. The film's early scenes really convey to me just the enormous privilege that Europeans and Americans, now at least many Americans, enjoyed in that area, and they had enjoyed really for decades. So you could have a Chinese chauffeur, you could have Chinese servants. There could be someone like Colin was alluding to, begging just kind of outside the gates of the estate. But you had this incredibly privileged lifestyle within that area. And the Japanese, they'd been in China for 4 years by this point, and they had taken most of the city already in 1937. And so yet they don't want unnecessary trouble with Britain or the U.S. or France, etc. So they keep their distance from the settlement until after Pearl Harbor. And I think that itself just gives a lot of insight about what imperialism looked like in China prior to, obviously the communist takeover. And you get a real glimpse of that about, Jamie's own, the kind of life he lives, and how his parents relate to their servants, and there's just a lot I think there that's extremely insightful. In fact, those were my favorite parts of the film, to be honest.
Yeah, they're not very sympathetic, I suppose, characters in the beginning of these people who are living lives of luxury, and these where, as they go into the city, they see these desperate people trying to escape Japanese encroachment, or fleeing from the countryside to hopefully find some security in a city that's been taken over by the Japanese. So yeah, it's definitely a world apart. I've seen Shanghai in the international settlements described as a Russian nesting doll, like a city within a city, surrounded. And yeah, they're cocooned in there. They're very secure, very stable. But you can definitely tell sort of the relationships between the Chinese, their servants, their chauffeurs, their valets. it's one that they're doing for a wage or a living. It's not based on, any type of loyalty or fealty or, friendship or good feeling to them, because as soon as the Japanese come in, the servants are gone. They're looting the place. So I definitely think it's much more antagonistic maybe than the film portrays.
What about the portrayal of the Zhuhao internment camp? And that's where I have issues with this film, is that the way the film portrays this. It's almost, as I talked about in the previous days, maybe I probably shouldn't have, but that it's kind of like a Boy Scout camp. It shows it through the eyes of the boy, and it's this happy-go-lucky kind of, this is a lark kind of a thing, and it wasn't. For some people say, and I've read accounts here in the last couple of days that if there was a child and they wrote accounts of the camp as a child, it's very similar to what Ballard wrote. They saw things a very different way than the 3 or 4 of us sitting here at this table would see it now. They're not looking at people starving to death, or they are, but they're not connecting it. They're not seeing or putting together that people are getting beaten from moving while they're at in a Pell in the morning, and that happened. So if you see that, like you were saying, Kim, you look at it through the eyes of a child, I guess it could be accurate, and that's what other children remembered seeing. But then if you look at accounts of adults too, it's far, far different. What's your opinion on that?
Well, thinking back to what I have been told by people who had been imprisoned by the Japanese as children, and this is not in China, but in the Philippines or Java, so other places. But he, these children would, play games, like they would go outside after the air raids and collect the shrapnel. So your life kind of became, you built your life in that environment, and that was your normal. So, these children didn't know any different. And, Ballard did, I know, come under some criticism from fellow prisoners after, because they said, that wasn't accurate, or also,
sugarcoated.
They told him that, I guess he came under some criticism for portraying people in a negative light who actually could be recognized, so he kind of called out people, I guess. But, he said it was firmly based on true experiences, so either his own or those of other internees. And, I think that became normal. That was his landscape. And certainly if that film had been from, the point of view of another person, it would have looked very different. I'm sure.
Yeah. And I've read some of the things talking about Ballard and his novel and the other prisoners' rebuttals, if you will, from the novel. And I forget exactly what he says in the novel, but he talks about going through the camp and playing with other boys and, basically kind of having a gang, and not in a bad way, but like, just a group of kids. They ran around, they did whatever they wanted to do. And then there are other people that survived that camp who were kids and remembered him and said, no, he was a loner. He stayed by himself. Nobody wanted to play with him. So, you kind of, you read that, and then you read what goes on in the movie and in the book, and it's like, what is what? What's real and what's not? Who's full of it and who isn't? What about you, Jason?
Yeah, I tend to share your skepticism about the way the internment camp is depicted, and I think that's also just part of the downside of having or viewing it through a child's perspective, or I would say in this case a child's perspective that's so admiring of the Japanese. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's one of the things that's interesting about Jamie is his fascination with Japanese culture and admiration for the Japanese, and you see that in several places in the film. And I know that people later who will recount their own experiences, they had real issues with the novel, and maybe even more so with the film about that you're getting a look at the Japanese internment system through the lens of a kid who really admires the Japanese and how much is being skewed there. And I think that has to be taken into account when you see how they treat people in there, especially adults, when, of course, the story is really a story about a kid who's 13 or so.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Colin?
It is similar to accounts you read of civilians, especially young people in the UK, playing on the bomb site. That became, something, they became in this destroyed landscape of, cities like Coventry or London. That's became their playground. So I can understand, sort of finding novelty and escapism in collecting, bits of bombs or things that you find around. There was a football pitch at the internment camp, so there, were some amenities. But also how you could make a film that shows the true, consequences and horrors of, cholera and dysentery and people starving to death and dying of dehydration in a PG-13 film.
Right.
I'm not sure how you could do it and still want to tell Ballard's story. I mean, maybe if David Lean had directed it instead of Spielberg, you might have had that opportunity.
So I guess that goes back to what was Spielberg really trying to do here? Was he trying to make a movie about the book, or was he trying to make a movie about the internment? And I, for one, really can't answer that question because I can't tell. I mean, anybody got an opinion on that one?
I mean, there are so many scenes in the film that in the camp that really, I think, provide these moments of, wow, in sort of intimate personal experiences. So the moment where, Jamie's in the family camp with sort of the family that's adopted him, Miranda Richardson and her husband, and they have sex, while he's watching, or at least are intimate. They don't,
Mm-hmm.
That's such a moment where, there being no private space, it's a really fascinating moment. And then also the moment where, the doctor, or right after the air raid, right, when the hospital is completely, every area in the camp is demolished. The hospital is demolished, the doctor's beaten. And that's such a fascinating moment, one, because of, Jamie's, sort of bowing before the Japanese commander, I guess. But, I think there are those moments where, sort of a more personal glimpse into aspects of camp life that have been documented come through. So I know that didn't really address the question that you asked, whether or not Steven Spielberg was going for, and, sorry about that. I went off on a tangent there.
No, not at all.
Do you think it's really like what this is ultimately a kind of coming of age or end of innocence kind of story? I mean, that's one of the things that when it was all over, I was trying to make sense of, like, what is this really about? And I think it, as Colin was just pointing out, that it's really, it's not a film that's going to focus on Japanese internment, or, you even think about how the Japanese are going to treat the Chinese civilian population. It's talking about something that's really skirted in the film. I mean, you see people pouring into the city, fleeing, but that whole issue about what's going to happen to those people and how they're going to be treated under occupation is just, a lot of that is just sidestepped. But I think what the film really tries to do is, by focusing on this child and you seeing the war through Jamie's eyes, is you get this kind of age of innocence story, or end of innocence story, and I think, of course, that raises its own question about the adequacy of a story like that for telling, a story about the Second World War in China. I mean, that it raises its own question, but that's how at least I took the film ultimately, to be a kind of story. In this case, I think Spielberg really liked the story that J.G. Ballard had presented, and thought this is a great story about a kid in terrible circumstances and how he grows up in a way in those circumstances.
It's a film about separation, certainly. I think Spielberg had said that his parents had divorced when he was a teenager, and I think that sort of comes through in a lot of his 80s films, especially of the sort of separating a child from a family, or a child has to sort of find their own way in the world. So I definitely think you see that. So coming of age, but also that that separation of this kid who's sort of adrift and lost. But yeah, he's a privileged British kid. It would be a much different film if it was starring a Chinese child escaping into Shanghai from the countryside.
Yeah, which I mean, I know that's not what the movie's about, but man, does it sure to miss the mark on that one. But we kind of touched about it, or you did, Jason, about his admiration for the Japanese, and this is something that really struck me in this movie too, in that. It's no secret that we here at the World War II Museum come in contact with a lot of World War II veterans, many of which fought in the Pacific, and they don't exactly always have the highest praise for the Japanese. And I mean, history's there in front of you. You can read about what happened in China. You can read about what happened in the Philippines. I don't need to tell you, or maybe some people do. But besides that, let's discuss that. His admiration for the Japanese. Where does that come from, and how is that actually portrayed, or the enemy? How is the enemy portrayed in this movie?
Yeah, I think his fascination with it's interesting that where his fascination really lies, because a lot of people who from Europe or the United States who admire Japanese culture prior to the whole era of anime and the like, that's a whole other thing. But like in this earlier period, the fascination was often with the samurai, the shoguns, ninjas. I mean, was these kind of pre-modern kind of warrior traditions of Japan. And for example, in Germany, there was long before Hitler's alliance with Japan, there was a long kind of German fascination with the samurai, with Zen Buddhism, etc. But his fascination seems to be less than with Japan as a modern military industrialized power. His fascination with aircraft, and like how fascinated he is by the crashed plane, and that I think that he's got this interest in technology and in kind of industrial military might that's very different, at least strikes me as very different from this kind of fascination with Japan for the very opposite reason. Japan somehow embodied this pre-modern, honorable warrior tradition, or something about Japanese spirituality you would often see. And his doesn't seem to be that. It seems to be very much a modern military, kind of enchantment with Japan. The Japan that produces Zeros and aircraft carriers than it is the Japan with guys with samurai swords and crossbows.
Yeah, it's his childhood bedroom. You just have to look up. I know when I saw the movie as a kid, I was really envious of his bedroom because he's got all the cool planes hanging from the ceiling. Yeah, and that comes through with most of Ballard's writing. I mean, he's an industrial writer. Crash and High Rise, it's about that. It's about mechanization and sort of the mechanization of humanity. Yeah, he likes their stuff. He's a kid. He likes the stuff that sparkles and whizzes and goes bang. But his admiration of the Japanese, I think you see, is almost a survival instinct. He's looking to, once he runs out of food initially and tries to surrender to the Japanese, unsuccessfully and ultimately successfully, I think he realizes very quickly that he has to find a new unit or gang to belong to. He doesn't have the skills to survive, so I don't know. It's like the old prison adage of finding the biggest guy in the prison yard and either picking a fight with him or getting him to like you very quickly. So I think it's based on survival that the Japanese are the most powerful, or he at least perceives them as the most powerful compared to the other European and American civilians who are powerless and interned and taken away, or the Chinese who also appear helpless and not very sympathetic to him.
I never thought about it that way. What about you, Kim?
Yeah, I think I also considered that. Here he is completely untethered. He is completely kind of this helpless kid, really. And this might be different than Ballard's situation because that's where, Ballard wasn't by himself the entire time. But, he did align himself sort of with, he was going to do what it took to survive. And, that was, ingratiating himself with the guards at some points. But then also, with Basie, of course, that really amazing character, amazing, cruel, weird, funny, bad character. So I think, I saw his appreciation or admiration of the Japanese as a survival instinct, but also mixed in with it's kind of cool. They have the cool planes, but so did, the Americans.
So did the Americans, yes.
Yeah, I can understand the attraction towards the airplanes, as you were saying. Most kids are, most kids are attracted to airplanes because, let's be honest, they're cool.
We see it every day.
Yeah, they're neat. I'm 40 years old and I still love airplanes. They're awesome. But, there's scenes in the film where, where he does things, he steals from the Japanese. Mm-hmm. That would not have flown, man. That would not have flown. That would have gone over one time and it would have ended one time. And, there's things in there that just, they bother me because it wouldn't have happened, man. It just wouldn't have happened. I don't believe anyway. And I think his admiration for them may be more along the lines of maybe he admires the airplanes more than he does the actual people. At least I would think. But hell, I don't know.
He's a British kid born in China. He's never been to the UK.
That's very
true. He's never been to Europe. He's never these ties that should connect him to a European tradition. He doesn't have. He's the social integration and those reinforcements don't really exist, and especially they become broken down very, very quickly when he's left on his own.
Yeah, no, you're very, very correct.
Did anybody else just have the wonder about him, given the kind of pampered, ultra bourgeois upbringing he has, that like he was attracted to Japan and aircraft because he wanted some kind of daring life of adventure, and the Japanese represented that, and I guess the Americans had represented that to him, as well. The way he looks at those P-51s and that raid, late in the film, that there's something like this kind of life I think that he's thought about that's not cozy and everything taken care of, and maybe that kind of accounts for his being drawn to aircraft and military hardware in the way that he was. I don't know. That was my first thought about it.
Well, how are the different nationalities depicted here? And there's a lot of them. It's not just the Brits. There's Americans, as we said. There's Dutch. There's a lot of different, and obviously the Chinese and Japanese as well. But John Malkovich is the the lead American character, if you will. How are they portrayed in your eyes?
I think they're portrayed as opportunists and thieves, basically.
Yeah, I certainly agree about the Americans. I thought the case of the Chinese was really interesting in how the film does show the kind of divisions in Chinese society. Where the party that was mentioned, where this one Chinese guest says that we're going to be here. We're a nation of 500 million people. We're going to survive this. We'll be around. And then you see the case of the servants, when Jamie goes back to the house hoping to find his parents there, or they find him there, and he stays there and sees them looting the house, and he yells at them about putting that stuff back, and the woman just walks over and slaps him. And I thought that too was really telling and showing how that people in the kind of the lower, that people that were forced to work or didn't have many better options of working as servants there, that how they really felt about being talked to in such a way, and that really came through. And so I thought the depiction of the Chinese, there wasn't enough of it for me in this film. It's such a film obviously about China, even though the story is very much about Europeans who've been sequestered and interned. But I thought what we did see was really interesting.
And she probably wanted to slap that boy for
Yeah.
11
Ages.
years.
Yeah.
That was great.
Yeah, this is my opportunity.
I appreciated the moment very much.
What about the bully? The sort of bully, the kid that
The street
bully,
urchin.
yeah.
No mommy, no daddy, no whiskey soda, or whatever the line is. The Japanese are, other than the sort of failed kamikaze pilot, are sort of very one-dimensional. It's they're sort of fanatical, Bushido adherents, and you're not really sure what their goals are other than plundering and meting out violence. In which, again, I think we talked about. It's not sort of casting the film and what their claims are on Chinese and Western colonial territory and what their motivations are. But they're just sort of here all of a sudden. They're angry and hitting and killing everyone. And other than the sort of the younger friend of Jamie's, they're all depicted as one way, sort of lockstep, Bushido adherents who want to destroy everything in their path.
Well, I think that's kind of Spielberg does that in a lot of his war movies. I mean, look at Saving Private Ryan.
Sure.
I mean, every German that's in that movie, with the exception of Steamboat Willie, is this robotic machine. And I mean, I don't think it's very much different in any of his war movies that he's done, including Schindler's List, with the exception of Ammon, obviously. But I think that the portrayal of, or Malkovich rather, his character, I think it's actually kind of rather accurate to a point. And that he's a merchant seaman, or was, I guess. And I mean, if you knew any of those guys from back that time, or hell, if you read anything about some of those guys, were lifelong sailors, and this wasn't the United States Navy. They were they were sailors to the nth degree, more so than Grandpa, who was on the Alabama. They were much different types of sailors, and I think that's kind of an accurate portrayal of that type of lifestyle for those guys back in that day. If anybody's ever seen The Sand Pebbles, there's a couple of scenes in that movie in the bar where Steve McQueen and his crew meet some of the same types of guys, and they're very, very similar to Malkovich's character. Well, this is an important one, and I'd like to talk about this one. Is the backdrop of the Second Sino-Japanese War clearly presented in this film? And I don't know which one of you guys presented that question, but whoever did, please speak up. But I think we can talk about this one ad nauseum here for a while if we're not careful. So.
Yeah, no, it's certainly not, other than the sort of scrolling text and narration at the beginning of the film. But even then, it's saying that the Japanese were waiting for Pearl Harbor, and as Jason said, the Japanese had been in China for 4 years at this point, and making demands on Chinese sovereignty for long before that.
1931. No.
Sure. So no, it's not really cast in. This is why the Japanese are here, and this is sort of the course of the war, and it's taking in Japan's ultimate goal. It's the Japanese are suddenly here. They're angry, and everybody's getting got, and there's really no explanation, of their motives and what they ultimately want. And yeah, it is a bit confusing too if you don't know the sort of background situation. I know when I saw it as a kid, I didn't know that the Japanese already controlled Shanghai, except for the international settlements until 1941. So it seems like when they're marching in with their tanks, that the Japanese have finally invaded just now. So for a layperson or someone who doesn't have a lot of background information on the story, it can kind of be confusing as to what's actually happening and when.
Mm-hmm. I mean, of course, there's a debate that the Second World War started
right.
when Japan invaded China, in 1931, and 37 is the big invasion, obviously.
Sure.
But there was there was the Mukden incident and the Marco Polo Bridge and all that in 1931. So, I mean, this had been going on for a very, 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 very long time, and there were millions of Chinese who were killed up to this point, and there would be millions more killed afterwards. I don't even think, and if somebody knows, please chime in. I don't think they actually have anywhere close to an accurate representation of how many Chinese were killed during World War II. Anybody?
Well, the number that I saw, just looking at different numbers, and everyone still argues about it, is one was 14 million, and that's disputed. It could be significantly higher. It could be much closer to 20. but that was one more conservative estimate, was 14 million killed. And that's the 37 to 45 conflict. It does not take into account 31. It's 37 to 45.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that the Chinese, or the invasion of China, rather, by the Japanese is portrayed at all very well in this movie. And again, I mean, the argument can be made that that's not what it necessarily is about, for sure. And I agree with you too, Colin, 100%, that if you don't know anything about the subject at all, you're like, why the hell are these people here, and why are they so angry?
Right.
Well, they've been angry for a long time, let's be honest. What about you, Kim?
Yeah, it's confusing. If you didn't know anything about the war in China before, you learn nothing from this film, really. And also even to, understand the different nationalities in the camp, the Americans. It's a little, it does require a little bit of base knowledge if you want to see it as a World War II film. If you're seeing it as something other than a childhood, story.
And the fact that it spends so much time on 1945, I thought was also just kind of that the scenes showing 45 really do to stretch out. And so I think for anybody who is coming to that film saying, okay, this is Empire of the Sun, and so I'm going to really learn something about Japan and China and World War II, that they're really going to be frustrated, I think, when they get into the film and see how that is presented, that they're going to have to do a lot of homework outside of it to make sense of what's shown.
Yeah, that's a very good point. We were talking before we actually started recording here that, it's Empire of the Sun. And, of course, the Japanese symbol was the rising sun. So the title of the movie it alludes to, like you just said, that you're going to learn something about the Japanese Empire. And nope, you don't. You don't learn anything about the Chinese. You don't learn anything about the Japanese either.
They had cool planes. That's what you come away with.
The Zero was definitely ahead of its time. There's no doubt about that. But to that end, China is often overlooked in the discussion of World War II, at least here in the United States. And why do you think that they've become an almost forgotten ally? And I think this can kind of go back to what you were on the episode when we talked about Anthropoid.
Yep.
And I think it's very similar. And that it's not that, yes, there were Americans fought in China. I mean, the CBI, it was an important theater in our war history. Merrill's Marauders, the Flying Tigers, those are really the only two units that you really think about. But because of the fact that we didn't have as many boots on the ground in China as we did in France or the Philippines or wherever it may be, it is kind of forgotten. But what's you guys' take on it?
Yeah, I mean, our guy lost. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, after outlasting the Japanese for 7 or 8 years, they're running in mainland China 4 years after. So I guess how do you make that story compelling that the dog that we backed in that race ultimately didn't win, especially when contrasted with more triumphal stories and images that we have from D-Day and flag raising on Iwo Jima. How do you make that story compelling? Which is unfortunate because China had an important role to play, tying down hundreds of Japanese personnel and military there, and suffered enormously Americans' focus on the Japanese barbaric treatment of American and POWs at the Japanese hands, which is true, but there were tens of millions of Chinese who were starved, beheaded, and buried alive, turned into human test subjects by the Japanese. So no, I don't know how you really make that into a compelling, inspiring story. But also, yeah, it's foreign to us. It's a narrative of a people who were ultimately taken over by Mao Zedong and their communists and their our enemies in the greater Cold War.
Yeah, I think that Seth just pointed out those two units that I think most Americans, when they think of it, the Flying Tigers are the one they mostly remember, and some may remember Merrill's Marauders, too. But China suffers the second highest number of killed in the entire conflict, only behind the Soviet Union, and so it's sort of sealed away from the rest of the war for so many Americans, and it's interesting that the war itself is so fascinating the Soviets, in fact, up until the U.S. does get involved, I mean, the Soviets are providing all kinds of air support to Chiang Kai-shek because they're terrified that if he falls, and this is the issue about what the war in China means for so many of countries, is that if Chiang Kai-shek falls, Stalin was terrified that Japan was going to move on him next. And so he was doing everything he could to keep them in that conflict until other help came. And what if China had fallen? What would Japan have been able to do if China had come to terms in some way, if Chiang Kai-shek had made some kind of deal? And yet it just doesn't ever rise to that kind of significance in, I think, for Americans, in accounts about how we think about the war and the different theaters of the war.
And it's the forgotten. I mean, hell, here at the museum, I mean, we cover it, but it's only one small gallery. And I mean, there were a lot of our people over there. There just wasn't a lot of fighting for the United States and the China-Burma-India theater, China specifically. And there wasn't a whole, there wasn't a Peleliu, there wasn't an Iwo Jima in China. It wasn't there. And it didn't dominate the headlines. I mean, think about it. In World War II, of the two units that I named, the Tigers and the Flying Tigers and the 5307th, what other things could you think of right now that happened in China that relates to the United States? I can think of one, the Doolittle raid.
Yeah, I think
the silence is thunderous.
Yeah.
You
I think that what would be the Panay, and that's in 37, right?
Yeah.
And where there's all the pressure put on Roosevelt to not take strong action against the Japanese because of that. Mm-hmm. But that's the only other one I can think of.
That's what I'm saying, is that it wasn't widely covered in American press because other things dominated the headlines. And I think that's one reason why, our collective memory is faint on the Chinese theater, because we weren't as heavily involved in it as we were in Europe or in the Pacific. Kim?
I think part of it is just flat-out racism as well, in American society where, that story is, Colin said it, foreign. It's sort of a foreign story in the Pacific, in Asia in general. So, we produced pamphlets in order so American soldiers could tell the difference between a Chinese and a Japanese person, and they are incredibly racist pamphlets, and so I think that comes into play. I think it's probably also, largely it wasn't it wasn't the story of Americans fighting there. Mm-hmm. But I think I do think that, racism does come into play.
And it's a shame too, because when you look at the Chinese theater, or the CBI, I mean, that's what we call it. There were things that went on there that helped or not other parts of the war in the Pacific. I mean, a lot of people think when we bombed the strategic bombing campaign of Japan that everything came from the Marianas, and obviously the vast majority of it did. But the first strategic bombing campaign against Japan was launched from India and China. The B-29s launched from China first to go and bomb Japan, and that's something a lot of people don't know. China was a huge ally of the United States, or of the Allies during the Pacific War. And I know there's a lot of modern scholarship that is starting to bring that to light, and it's a good thing, frankly. Because I mean, had China not tied down all those millions of Japanese troops on the Chinese mainland, where would those Japanese have gone? Where would they have been put? Would there have been, 3 times as many troops on Iwo Jima? I don't know. I mean, I'm just, or would there have been 10 times as many troops in the Philippines? So, I mean, the fact that they held down that many people for that long benefited us greatly, and I think that's just now starting to come to light. But how does this film, how does Empire of the Sun fit within the larger body of Spielberg's work? And obviously, we've done several of his films here. We've done Private Ryan. We've done Schindler's List. We're going to do Jaws next. No.
E.T.
Yeah, Close Encounters.
Well, they do have a scene on the Indianapolis in Jaws now. But anyway, how does Empire of the Sun fit within the larger body of his work? And in particular, I guess we should say his World War II type films. What is your opinion on that?
I think it's the weakest of the World War II films myself, but that I know at the end we'll come back to our own like evaluations of the film. But one thing I would say for Spielberg is that the fact that he did make a film that was not centered on Americans. I mean, it is a British kid Christian Bale plays, and the film comes out on the 50th anniversary of the Japanese invasion of China. I think that often gets overlooked. It came out in '87. And the fact that there was a film there, it's not obviously terribly helpful, as we've talked about, in terms of for people to understand all the dynamics of that. But I also want to give him some credit for tackling a topic that would have been much easier for him to just avoid altogether. And since that Americans are not central to the story.
Colin?
His World War II films, I would agree, and I think it fits in pretty well with his 80s output, certainly, and that it's half adventure film like Indiana Jones, and then it's half sort of a kids or child focused movie like E.T. or Goonies, obviously with a much more serious background, but I think it fits well into that. But no, it's you can make an argument that war is kind of this backdrop that's happening. Is Die Hard a Christmas movie? Is Empire of the Sun a war movie? I think you can make arguments that either way that it's the war is there and it's sort of the preeminating event, but I'm not sure if it could really be classified as a war film against The Longest Day, say.
Yeah, Kim.
Yeah, I think it fits into, it's much more closely aligned with his, with his childhood-focused movies than with the war films.
Yeah, and what's interesting too, and it just occurred to me now, we're talking about the CBI theater and Spielberg and his dad served in the CBI. His dad was a ground crew for the Burma Bridge Busters, B-25 unit, in the China-Burma India Theater. So, and I mean, he obviously knew that at that time. It's not something that dawned on him later on. So it's kind of interesting that the way that this movie folds out when you take that into consideration. Well, Kim, I'll start with you. Did you like it, and would you recommend this film?
I did like it, yeah. I think there were some really powerful moments in the film. I would recommend it. I think it is really interesting in terms of a translation of Ballard's experience or the representation of a kid's experience and this traumatic scene. Ballard talked about, finding them, and his main effort as a boy was to find the real in all this make-believe, and I think it's a really surreal, he sets a real surreal stage in a lot of areas. So I would recommend it, yeah. Not for someone looking to find out information about, the war in China, but as a work of, about a young boy.
Jason?
I didn't particularly like it, no. I liked parts of it. I liked certain moments of it a great deal, but overall I found the film just really tedious at times, and I think I usually like Spielberg's films for their pacing, and they can keep your interest. They're often very exciting. I found this one to be less so, but I would still recommend it because when you look at, certainly in the U.S., anything dealing with China and Japan and issues about internment, and like the film is always referenced. When I was doing my kind of homework, kind of getting ready, everything you saw when you brought up these particular sites referenced the novel and the film. And I think that if you're going to understand something about World War II in the Pacific, certainly with respect to China, it's one of those films that's always going to be brought up. So in that sense, I think it's just something people need to see if they're going to consider this issue and how it's been represented in movies.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, Kim.
Do you think that that's because there's few other representations of that experience?
Yes, definitely.
English language version.
English language film,
certainly.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of, not counting 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, which is the second half is in China, I can think of one other movie, and that's Bridge on the River Kwai, which is a fantastic movie. But anybody else?
No.
When it deals with China?
Well, I mean, there's the Last Emperor parts of it.
Mm-hmm.
Parts of it deal with Manchuria, but not so much, not 37 to 45 in this sense. So that gets to your point. Yeah, there's virtually nothing.
Yeah. Colin?
I enjoyed it. I would recommend it, certainly. It's rare you get to see an actor sort of grow up in front of the camera. And Christian Bale, who's still successfully acting in major motion pictures, and certainly some of the more physically challenging roles he's taking on. He seems to really enjoy getting really fat and getting really thin. But it was fascinating to see this kid in front of you just giving a really powerful performance. Him and Malkovich both I thought were great. Malkovich is he's so cool in terms of just detached and deadpan and amoral. It really makes you want to be sort of a creepy expat is like the coolest thing you can aspire to. But I like it too because it does turn the camera around to the people caught in between. People sort of helpless in the path of this worldwide conflict that they couldn't escape. And the fact that it's not glorious or triumphal, it's dirty, it's cheap. There's people dying right in front of you, and the actors seemingly powerless, or not even powerless, sort of predatory. It's not good guys shepherding this kid around. It's seeing, hey, what can I get for this, or what can I get for you? When Jamie's begging Basie to take him with him when he escapes, he said, "Why should I take you?" It's like, because I'm your friend. And friendship has no market value in where they are, so I really liked that, and I thought Malkovich and Bale were really good in it.
I would agree with Jason. I did not like this movie. I didn't. I struggled. I really did. I struggled to get through the film. To me, it's sugarcoats too much, I think. And I mean, I get it. We've talked about it here quite a bit. I get it. It's war seen through the eyes of a child. I understand that. But there's a lot of stuff that is just covered over. And if you want to see a movie that's good, that, in my opinion, that sees the war through the eyes of a child, go watch Hope and Glory. That's a really, really good movie.
We had tried to watch it, and I struggled to get through that.
Did you really?
So I didn't. So which is funny because it came out the same year.
Yeah.
And I think it got nominated for a lot of Academy Awards as well.
Yeah. Well, see. Difference of opinion makes the world go around, right? Well, final thoughts. Kim, can you sum your opinion of this movie up in a sentence or two?
Yeah, I think it was a dystopian, Dickensian coming-of-age tale.
Thank you, Kim, and we're done. All right.
I was topping that.
I don't know how one can follow that up. I would just characterize it as there's just a tension in the film between it being a kind of end of innocence story and a film about Japan and China. And I think that's where the film has a lot of promise. And I think that tension is also what, for me, weakens it.
Colin?
Hey, kid, would you like a Hershey bar? No, I think I enjoyed it greatly, just in seeing, oftentimes we do have these sort of triple canopy shots of these worldwide events, and I like this microcosm, this little world that Jamie inhabited.
Mm-hmm.
And I like at the end, too, when he's reunited with his parents, and he's unrecognizable, then sort of semi-feral, and I wonder how it was to go home again with them. I doubt it was their relationship was ever the same. And it certainly, you can see in Ballard's writing and his influence, how the war really shaped his view. So no, I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I thought it was, I thought it was slow. I thought it was slow, and that it sugarcoated things, as I said. And there were a lot of loose ends, in my opinion. Things that happened in the movie or didn't happen, for that matter, that I just didn't care for it. And not one of my favorites, but again, everyone's entitled to their opinion. But anyway. So I want to thank you so much for listening. And if you'd like to hear more about the events we discussed today, listen to our mini episode next week, where we will share oral histories from civilians who were held by the Japanese during World War II. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Service on Celluloid. Be sure to rate and review us on iTunes if you like what you hear. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, our producer, Tessa Jager, and our sound engineer, Jeremy Burson. This has been a production of the National World War II Museum.